the Ides of March 44 BC, more than 60 Roman senators conspired to kill Julius Caesar in a Senate chamber inside the theatre of Pompey. Among them were Marcus Brutus, Cassius, and the man who held the door. This is the story of the policy that put them in the room with him. The republic Caesar grew up in was the one Sulla had left behind. In November of 82 BC, after winning the civil war against the followers of Gaius Marius at the Battle of the Colline Gate, Lucius Cornelius Sulla took the city. He had marched on Rome 6 years before, the first Roman commander ever to do so against the city itself, and now, victorious, he reactivated an office that had lain dormant since the Second Punic War, the dictatorship. He held it without a time limit. That had never happened. What Sulla did with that office is the politically formative event of Caesar's youth. He posted lists. The lists named citizens, senators, equestrians, men of standing, who were now hostes publici, public enemies. Their property was forfeit to the state. They could be killed on sight, anywhere, by anyone, in exchange for a bounty. Heads were brought to the forum for inspection. Some names were added after the fact. Sometimes a man's name appeared on a list because someone else wanted his villa. The proscriptions ran for months. Modern estimates of the dead range from 1,500 to 9,000, figures the ancient sources themselves give wildly. Sulla then voluntarily retired in 79 BC. What the proscriptions did to Roman politics is harder to count than the bodies. Until Sulla, the assumption of senatorial life was that political defeat ended in exile. You lost, you went to Rhodes or Massilia. Eventually, you came back. After Sulla, political defeat could end with your name on a tablet. The class of men who governed Rome had to absorb, as a working condition of their work, the fact that losing an argument could now kill them and their families and dispossess their grandchildren. This was not the first time Roman politics had become lethal. In 133 BC, the tribune Tiberius Gracchus had proposed a redistribution of public land to landless citizens, and when a fellow tribune named Octavius vetoed the bill, Gracchus had led an unprecedented vote to depose him. A senatorial mob, led by his cousin Scipio Nasica, beat him to death in the streets. It was the first political murder in the Republic since its founding. His brother Gaius died the same way 12 years later. So the cycle of political murder Caesar would later try to break was 33 years old by the time he was born. It had been running for 2 generations. The other inheritance was the army. In 107 BC, a generation before Sulla, Gaius Marius had opened recruitment to the Capitae Censi, the citizens too poor to qualify for the property-owning legions. The state armed them, the state paid them, but the state did not give them land when they were discharged. Their commander did, by lobbying the Senate for grants on their behalf. The veterans of any successful general now depended on that general, not on the institution, for the end of their working lives. Loyalty had moved. By the time Caesar was born, then, the Roman political order had 3 working conditions that were not in the constitution, but were now ineradicably part of it. That political enemies could be killed legally, that armies belonged to commanders, not to the state, and that the question of what to do with the losers of an internal fight no longer had a peaceful Roman answer. The boy Sulla almost killed grew up watching this. In 84 BC, when Caesar was about 16, his father died. Within months he was married to Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, the four-time consul who had led the Marian faction during Sulla's absence in the east. Cornelia was Caesar's wife. She was also by family a name on the wrong side of the war Sulla was about to win. When Sulla won, he sent for Caesar and ordered him to divorce her. Caesar refused. He was stripped of his inheritance. He was stripped of the priesthood he had been promised, the Flamen Dialis, the priest of Jupiter, which had been the central plan of his late teenage life. He went into hiding in the Sabine countryside, moving between farms at night, ill with what may have been malaria. Soldiers searched the towns. He was, technically, a man who could be killed on sight by anyone who recognized him. Friends of the family, including by tradition the Vestal Virgins, petitioned Sulla on his behalf, and Sulla reluctantly lifted the order. The line Plutarch records as Sulla's response is the one we still quote. They had no sense if they did not see in this boy many Mariuses. The phrase is single source. Plutarch is writing roughly 150 years after the event, and he loves a good prophetic quip. But the substance, that Sulla pardoned Caesar against his own political instincts because connected women asked him to, is consistent across the early sources. That is Caesar's first encounter with clemency. Notice what it teaches. Mercy, in the Rome the boy is growing up in, is what the powerful grant the weak. It is not an exchange between equals. It is not a settlement between adversaries. It is the dictator, on the advice of his women, condescending to let a child of his enemies live. The recipient owes the giver, and the debt is permanent. Caesar will spend the second half of his political life building a program around the inversion of that transaction. Mercy as policy rather than mercy as humiliation. Mercy as an offer of a settlement rather than a demonstration of who can kill whom. He will fail, in part because the inversion is harder than he thinks. There is no Roman word for mercy between equals. The grammar of clementia in Latin is the grammar of an asymmetry. To accept it is to ratify the asymmetry that made it available. We will come back to this. It is the central problem of the next 40 minutes. There is one night in December of 63 BC when the three voices of the late Republic share a room. It happens only once. The consul of that year is Marcus Tullius Cicero. He is 43 years old and the first man from his family ever to hold the consulship, what the Romans called a novus homo, a new man. He has just suppressed an attempted coup by the aristocrat Lucius Sergius Catilina. 5 conspirators have been arrested in Rome. The Senate is meeting in the Temple of Concord to decide what to do with them. 2 voices in the chamber are not yet famous. One belongs to Gaius Julius Caesar, praetor-elect, 37 years old. The other belongs to Marcus Porcius Cato, Cato the Younger, tribune-elect, 32, the great-grandson of the censor, already known for an uncomfortable rigidity in argument. Caesar speaks first of the 2. He argues for an unprecedented penalty, that the conspirators not be executed, but be distributed under guard to the towns of Italy, their property held in trust, the case left open. The Senate, he warns, will be setting a precedent. Once it executes Roman citizens without trial in an emergency, it will execute them again in conditions that will look less and less like emergencies. Then Cato rises. He argues for immediate execution. He argues that the Republic, in its present state, is not in a position to extend the niceties of due process to men who took up arms against it. The Sallust, who reconstructs the speech, is writing roughly 20 years after the event, and the wording is his, in the same way Thucydides composes the speeches of the Peloponnesian War. But the substance is reliable. The line Sallust gives Cato, the one that has carried best, is this: "For some time past, it is true, we have lost the real name of things. For to lavish the property of others is called generosity, and audacity in wickedness is called heroism." Cato wins. The conspirators are strangled in the Tullianum that night. Cicero, the consul who orders the executions, will spend the rest of his life defending the decision, and the rest of his life shadowed by the fact that he executed Roman citizens without trial. The three positions in the room are the three positions of the rest of the story. Caesar will keep arguing for the next 19 years that the Republic should not kill its enemies when it does not need to. Cato will keep arguing for the old discipline of vengeance, in which the punishment is the proof of the institution's seriousness. Cicero will keep choosing whichever of the two positions seems most likely, that month, to preserve the institution he loves. The argument in that chamber, "What does the Republic do with its enemies?" never closes. It just escalates. The next 13 years take Caesar from praetor to dictator. In 59 BC, he holds his first consulship, in alliance with Pompey, the Republic's most successful general, and Crassus, its richest man. The political settlement modern historians call the First Triumvirate, though no Roman at the time called it that. By the end of his consular year, Caesar has secured himself an extraordinary 5-year command in Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and Transalpine Gaul. For the next 8 years, he is in Gaul. He fights what Roman historians, working in the most consequential genre of Latin prose, will treat as wars of conquest. Plutarch and Appian, writing more than a century later, will give a round figure of 1 million Gauls killed and 1 million enslaved. Modern demographers treat both numbers as propaganda rounding rather than census. What we can say is that the slaughter of the Usipetes and the Tencteri, Germanic peoples who attempted to cross the Rhine in 55 BC, is documented as a mass killing of non-combatants in Caesar's own writing, at a scale he himself describes but does not credibly count. In 53 BC, Crassus dies invading Parthia at Carrhae. The triumvirate becomes a duumvirate. Pompey drifts toward the conservative core of the Senate. By 51 BC, Caesar's enemies, Cato above all, are demanding that he disband his army and return to Rome to stand trial for the actions of his consulship. The argument runs for almost 2 years. On the night of the 10th or 11th of January 49 BC, Caesar crosses the Rubicon, a small stream marking the southern boundary of his province, at the head of a single legion. By doing so, he becomes a Roman general in arms inside Italy. The act is what Sulla had done 39 years before. The Senate flees south. Pompey evacuates to Greece. The civil war begins. We will hear what Cicero made of that night in a letter we still have later in this script. For now, Caesar takes Italy in 3 months, fights for 4 years across Spain, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa, and emerges in 45 BC as the only surviving political force in the Roman world. What he does with that position is what the rest of the video is about. To understand what Caesar is doing when he begins pardoning his enemies in 48 BC, you have to hold in your head what Sulla had done 33 years earlier. In the months after the Colline Gate, Sulla posted his lists. The names on them were the names of men we know. Marcus Marius Gratidianus, a praetor who had been popular with the urban plebs for currency reform, was hunted down, tortured at the tomb of Quintus Lutatius Catulus by Catulus's son and by Catiline himself, and killed. His head was carried to Sulla. Lucan and later sources elaborate the mutilation in lurid detail. Eyes and hands cut off, the body dismembered in the streets. Plutarch's earlier account in Sulla preserves only the head sent to Sulla, and the more graphic tradition is the work of writers a century or more after the act. Quintus Lucretius Ofella, who had won Sulla one of his key victories at Praeneste, and then tried to stand for the consulship without Sulla's permission, was killed in the Forum by a centurion sent personally by Sulla. The killing was a public lesson on the limits of even loyal ambition. Sextus Roscius, a propertied man from the Umbrian town of Ameria, had his name added to the lists after the fact by a freedman with connections, so that his son could be defrauded of the estate. The case that, 3 years later, gave a young provincial advocate named Cicero his first sensational success in court. These are not the most famous proscriptions, they are the ones whose details we have. The lists were longer. When it was over, Sulla retired to a villa in Campania. He died there of liver failure in 78 BC, peacefully, having outlived almost every man he had killed. The institutions he had used, he had also broken. The Senate he had refilled with his veterans was no longer the Senate that had existed before him. The number of men who had been killed in his lists was finite. The number of men who now lived as the relatives or beneficiaries of those killings was, for political purposes, the whole governing class. Caesar, in 48 BC, after the Battle of Pharsalus, has the same instrument available to him. He has just defeated the army of Pompey. The men who served under Pompey, Marcus Junius Brutus, Gaius Cassius Longinus, Marcus Tullius Cicero, are, by Sulla's example, hostes publici. He could post lists. He could enrich his own veterans by killing the men who had voted against him in the Senate before the war began. He doesn't. Instead, he announces that any of Pompey's senators who surrender will be received. Brutus, found alive after the battle, is given an embrace and a province. Cassius is pardoned and made praetor for 44 BC. Cicero, who had spent 2 years on the wrong side of the war, comes home to Italy under safe conduct. And then Caesar does something Sulla had not. He advertises it. In 44 BC, on coins struck under his authority, the personified figure of Clementia appears with his name attached. Clementia Caesaris, Caesar's clemency. The Senate decrees the construction of a temple of Clementia, a goddess of mercy, paired with Caesar himself, the first time a living Roman politician has been twinned with a deity in a state cult. The policy is no longer just an informal pattern of pardons in the aftermath of battles. It is a brand. It is being stamped onto Roman silver and built in Roman marble. The line Caesar is drawing between himself and Sulla is one of the most expensive public statements of his dictatorship. Modern historians are split on what to make of this. One reading, Clementia was the moral position of a man who had been the boy Sulla almost killed, and who had decided over 40 years that he would not become the man who killed boys. Another reading, equally well supported, Clementia was a power move, a public demonstration that Caesar, and only Caesar, held the authority to grant life. To accept the pardon was to accept the asymmetry that made the pardon available. Both readings are correct. The interesting thing about Caesar's program is that the moral content and the political content are the same content. The line is not that Caesar was merciful where Sulla was cruel. The line is that Caesar was building a settlement in which his right to grant or withhold mercy was the constitution. That is closer to monarchy than the conspirators could tolerate, and they were not wrong to see it. One man saw it from the very beginning and killed himself rather than ratify it. In April of 46 BC, Caesar's army crushed the last conventional military force the Senate could put in the field. The battle was fought at Thapsus, on the coast of what is now Tunisia. The commander on the Senate side, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Scipio, was killed in flight a few days later. Most of his senior officers, men who had spent 4 years in arms against Caesar, surrendered. Caesar pardoned them. One of them did not surrender. Marcus Porcius Cato had spent the years of the Civil War organizing the Senate's African base from the port of Utica. He had not been at Thapsus. He had been holding the city. When the survivors of the battle reached him with the news that the army was destroyed, he organized their evacuation. He arranged for those who wished to flee by ship to do so. He arranged for those who wished to surrender to Caesar to surrender. He himself would do neither. The night before his death, according to Plutarch, whose account is the source of nearly every detail and is itself a Plutarchian set piece written 150 years later, Cato dined with his officers and discussed Stoic philosophy. He argued in his bookish way that only the virtuous man is truly free. He asked for a copy of Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue in which Socrates, in prison, sets out his argument for why a philosopher should not fear death. He read it twice. Around midnight, he sent away his attendants. He stabbed himself with his own sword. He was 49 years old. The wound was severe but not immediately fatal. His doctor and his son, hearing him fall, ran in. The doctor began to stitch the wound closed. Cato, when he recovered consciousness, tore the stitches open with his own hands and pulled out his own intestines. By the time the household reached him again, he was dead. There is, in the violence of that, something the philosophy was not. But we have only Plutarch. The broad outline, that Cato killed himself at Utica rather than accept Caesar's pardon, and that he had been reading the Phaedo, is corroborated. The theatrical detail of the torn stitches is Plutarch's. Whether it happened that way, or whether it is the kind of moral set piece a later writer constructs around a known suicide, we cannot say. The substance of the act we can say. Cato understood what the pardoned senators only half understood. To accept Caesar's mercy was to admit Caesar's right to grant or withhold it. To admit Caesar's right to grant or withhold the lives of senators was to admit that the Senate was now an institution whose membership existed at one man's pleasure. And that institution, a Senate whose members served at the pleasure of a single magistrate, is, in everything but the title, a monarchy. Cato refused to become the debtor of a man whose authority he refused to ratify. He chose, instead, to die. His contemporaries understood the suicide as an argument. Cicero, in the months that followed, wrote a panegyric of Cato, a work now lost, called simply Cato, defending the death as a philosophical act. Caesar himself, when he read Cicero's pamphlet, was provoked to write an answer, a bitter prose attack called Anti-Cato, which is also lost, but whose existence is reported in Suetonius and in fragments preserved by later authors. The political class of Rome spent the next 2 years passing a pair of dueling polemics back and forth. The argument in those pamphlets is the argument that becomes the assassination. It is the argument about what mercy means. That is the cleanest articulation of the clementia mechanism the sources give us. Cato did consciously, in 46 BC what the conspirators will do half-consciously in 44 BC. He saw that the mercy was the mark of a sovereignty he refused to accept, and he resolved the contradiction by removing himself from the room. The men who killed Caesar 2 years later resolved the same contradiction by removing him. One of the men who could not become Cato, who would accept the mercy, write a pamphlet defending the man who refused it, and then watch his closest friends drive blades into his benefactor, sat at his villa near Naples and wrote letters about it in real time. We have, from the years of the Civil War, something we do not have for any other comparable period of Roman politics. We have the letters of Marcus Tullius Cicero. There are about 900 of them surviving, spanning 25 years, addressed mostly to his closest friend Titus Pomponius Atticus. They are real-time, first-person political journalism by a man who never meant them to be read by anyone else. What the letters give us for the events the rest of this video is talking about is what no other ancient source can give: the texture of an educated Roman senator's experience of his republic breaking around him. On a night in the middle of January 49 BC, within days of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, Cicero sits down at his villa at Formiae, south of Rome, and writes to Atticus. He is 57 years old. The Senate has fled, Pompey is moving south, the city is being abandoned by its government, and Cicero, who has no army and no following beyond his reputation, is trying to decide whether to leave with them. He starts by writing about Caesar. The Latin runs like this: O hominem amentem et miserum, quine umbram quidem umquam tu car, lu viderit. O wretched madman, never to have seen the shadow even of right. The Greek phrase in the middle, tu car lu, of the good, of right, is Cicero code-switching mid-sentence, the way an educated Roman of his class would do for a charged philosophical concept Latin had no clean word for. Caesar, to him, in this moment, is not merely a political rival. He is a man who has never even seen the idea of right action. 2 paragraphs later in the same letter, Cicero turns from Caesar to Pompey, who has decided to abandon Rome and fight the war from Greece. The letter contains, almost in shock, the phrase, urbem tu relinquas? You abandon the city? To Cicero, the Republic is the city. You cannot defend the Republic from somewhere else. You cannot fight Caesar from Greece. To leave Rome is to concede the only thing that makes the Republic worth fighting for. He is wrong about that, in a way. Pompey is making the right military decision, but Cicero is right in a deeper way that he himself does not articulate. By leaving the city, Pompey is conceding what Sulla had already conceded, that the institutional Republic is now an army camp. It is a thing that travels with whoever has the legions. This is also where we can most honestly handle the Rubicon. 3 sources, Suetonius, Plutarch, and Appian, report Caesar's crossing, and they disagree on what he said. Suetonius, writing 165 years later, gives a Latin phrase, iacta alea est, which is either the die is cast, or in some manuscripts, let the die be cast. Plutarch, writing around 100 years later, says it was Greek, ane ripto kibos, a line from a lost comedy by Menander, a line Caesar would have known the way an educated Englishman might know Shakespeare. Appian gives a small speech beforehand that the other 2 do not. These are our best sources. They were written 90 to 200 years after the event. They disagree on language and on tone. The one thing we know for certain is that Caesar crossed the river in arms. Everything we think we know about what he thought as he did it, every painting, every novel, every screen adaptation, is a literary tradition, not a fact. What is a fact is what Cicero wrote at his villa that week. We have the paper, we have the date. The horror in those sentences is the only contemporary first-person record we have of what it felt like in real time as the Republic stopped being a thing one could defend from inside it. 16 months later, after the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar will pardon Cicero in person. Cicero will write letters to friends complimenting the dictator's restraint and the moderation of his program, and in the same season he will be privately drafting the Cato. He is, by then, the audience-facing version of what Cato resolved by dying and what the conspirators will resolve by killing. The Cato of his pamphlet is doing in death what he, Cicero, cannot do in life: refuse the asymmetry. There are, in the end, 3 responses to clementia Caesaris, 3 reactions of the late Republican governing class to being offered mercy by the man who had become the only political force in Rome. Cato kills himself rather than accept it. Brutus accepts it and then kills the man who gave it. Cicero accepts it and cannot do either, and writes letters about how strange it feels until the triumvirate kills him too. The Senate Cicero writes from, by 45 BC, is not the Senate he had begun his career in. There is a portrait we should hold in mind for the next 5 minutes, because the institutional argument of this section can be carried by one man. Marcus Junius Brutus is 41 years old in the spring of 44 BC. His mother is Servilia, a half-sister of Cato the Younger and one of the most politically active women in Rome. Brutus's father had been killed by Pompey's troops in the civil wars of 78 BC. Brutus had grown up in his uncle Cato's household, and Cato's politics were his inheritance. In the year 49, when the Rubicon was crossed, Brutus chose Pompey's side, chose, that is, against the man his mother was sleeping with and for the political program of the uncle who had raised him. He fought at Pharsalus on the senatorial right wing. He was captured. Caesar's first inquiry after the battle was whether Brutus was alive. When he was told yes, he gave instructions that Brutus was to be brought to him. Brutus was brought. Caesar pardoned him, not formally, not by edict, but by walking forward and embracing him in front of officers. He then made him a personal companion, gave him a provincial governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, and in 44 BC made him praetor urbanus, the senior judge of the city of Rome. He was being groomed for the consulship. There is one more thing to know about him. The Junii Bruti claimed descent from Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who, in 509 BC, had expelled the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, and founded the Republic. The family's claim was that they were, by lineage, the men who killed kings. Whether the claim was historically true matters less than that the family believed it, and that everyone in Rome who knew Marcus Brutus knew it about him. The conspirators, when they sought him out partly for the lineage. The video reports this as motive, not as justification. We trust the audience to weigh it. Brutus, in March of 44 BC, was a man who had taken arms against Caesar, been spared, been promoted to the second most powerful magistracy in Rome by the man who had spared him, and was being asked by his fellow senators to recover his ancestor's reputation by killing the patron who had granted him all of it. The institutional context behind Brutus's position is the part of the story that gets told least often, and it is the part that closes the argument. Between 49 BC and 44 BC, Caesar enlarged the Roman Senate. The conventional figure since Sulla had been around 600 members. Under Caesar, it grew to around 900. The new seats went to his veterans, to provincial Italian notables, to Gaulish chieftains he had given citizenship to men who owed their political careers to him directly. The Senate Caesar would be killed in was, in its composition, his. In January or February of 44 BC, the Senate voted him the title dictator perpetuo, dictator in perpetuity. The title appears on the silver of the year. The legend on the coins, in abbreviated form, reads Caesar dict perpetuo, or dict in perpetuum. This is primary epigraphic evidence. Whatever Caesar's plans for the title were, whether he intended to make it hereditary, whether he intended to set it aside after the Parthian campaign he was planning, whether the title was the conclusion of his ambition or merely a stop on the way to Rex, we cannot say. The honours that look most monarchical cluster only in the final 6 months of his life. Reading them backward into a lifelong plan is teleology, not history. What the conspirators could see in the spring of 44 BC was that on the 15th of February, at the festival of the Lupercalia, Mark Antony, Caesar's consular colleague, had publicly offered Caesar a diadem from the speaker's platform. Caesar had refused it. Cassius Dio, writing 250 years later, reports him saying, "Jupiter alone is king of the Romans," and sending the diadem to be dedicated in the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitol. Dio is the source for the quotation. The script is being honest about source distance here. What is firmer is that the event was public, that Antony made the offer in front of the people, and that the spectacle of an offered crown and a refused crown was, whatever Caesar privately intended, what the conspirators read as a rehearsal. By March, Marcus Brutus was meeting with Gaius Cassius Longinus, pardoned, made praetor, the operational lead of what they were now calling themselves, not conspirators, but liberators. Other names entered the planning. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, who had served as one of Caesar's most trusted commanders in Gaul, who had been named in Caesar's original will as a secondary heir, a Caesarian in the proper sense, never an enemy at all. He is the man who held the door. Gaius Trebonius, Tilius Cimber, the brothers Servilius Casca. Roughly 20 names we know, 60 if Suetonius is right about the total number of conspirators, that we do not. The chamber that killed him was a chamber he had constructed. The Senate enlarged to accommodate his veterans and his pardonees was the Senate that found the institutional confidence to act. The mercy that had spared each of these men individually was the mercy that put them, collectively, in the same room with him. On the morning of the Ides, the man who walked Caesar to the chamber, the man who held the door, was the man Caesar had named as a secondary heir. On the morning of the 15th of March 44 BC, Caesar's wife Calpurnia tried to keep him at home. She had dreamed, according to several of the sources, of his death. Some versions say she dreamed of his statue collapsing and bleeding. The Senate was meeting that day in the Curia of Pompey, a chamber inside the larger Theatre of Pompey complex on the Campus Martius, because the regular Senate house had been damaged by fire and was being rebuilt. Caesar was not feeling well. He had decided not to attend. The man who arrived at the house then to walk him to the chamber was Decimus Brutus. Decimus mocked him gently for being moved by his wife's dreams. He pointed out that the Senate was already assembled, that to send them home now would be a public discourtesy, that the dictator of Rome could not be seen flinching at a woman's nightmare. Caesar agreed to go. They walked together through the Roman streets to the chamber. On the way, according to Plutarch and Suetonius, a soothsayer named Spurina intercepted him. Spurina had warned Caesar weeks earlier to beware the Ides of March. Caesar, passing him on the steps, mocked the prophet. "The Ides of March are come." Spurina's reply was, "Aye, they are come, but they are not gone." Spurina is named in Suetonius. He is not, contrary to common assumption, a Shakespearean invention. Caesar entered the chamber and sat. A senator named Tullius Cimber approached him with a petition, a request for the recall of his exiled brother. Cimber pulled at Caesar's toga, ostensibly to plead more urgently. The pull was the signal. The first blow came from behind. Publius Servilius Casca struck for the neck and missed. Caesar, surprised, grabbed his arm. Plutarch records Caesar's exact words at that moment, not as last words, but as the first thing he said after the first strike, as, "Accursed Casca, what doest thou?" Casca, panicking, called to his brother for help. The other conspirators closed in. He was stabbed 23 times. The wounds were to the chest, the face, and the groin. Plutarch reports that when Caesar saw Marcus Brutus among the men closing in on him, he pulled his toga down over his head and sank to the floor, either by chance or pushed there by his attackers, against the pedestal of the statue of Pompey that stood in the chamber. The pedestal, according to Plutarch, was drenched in his blood. This is the only unambiguously attested gesture of his death. About his last words, there is a sentence in Latin which is one of the most famous in the historical literature of the West. "Et tu, Brute?" You too, Brutus? That sentence is not in any classical source. It is Shakespeare's, written in 1599, and it is the dramatic invention of a playwright working 16 centuries after the event. What the classical sources have, instead, is a Greek phrase, kai si teknon, you too, my child, and they both flag it, when they give it, as a minority report. Suetonius writes that some have written that Caesar said it at Brutus's blow. Cassius Dio gives the same phrase, then explicitly says, "The version in which Caesar was unable to say anything and died silent under his toga is the truest account." Plutarch gives no last words at all, only Caesar's startled cry to Casca at the first blow, and then the gesture with the toga. We do not know what Caesar said as he died. We may not know because he didn't say anything. This is one of the most famous quotations in Roman history, and it is also one of the things the sources do not let us claim. The conspirators, when it was done, raised their daggers and called out for libertas, liberty. They walked out through the theatre of Pompey to address the people. The portico, when they reached it, was empty. The people had not stayed. The conspirators withdrew that afternoon to the Capitoline, the religious heart of the city, defensible, surrounded by the temples of the old gods. They styled themselves liberatores, the liberators. They sent for senators to join them. They sent for tribunes. They sent runners into the streets to announce that the tyrant was dead and the republic was restored. The senators did not come. The tribunes did not come. The people on the streets did not understand what they had been liberated from. Within days, Cicero, who had not been in the chamber, who was not party to the conspiracy, but who had cheered the deed when he heard of it, was writing to Atticus from his villa at Astura. The letter records the moment he understood that the men he had cheered had made a mistake. The deed, he wrote, had been done animo virile concilio puerile, with the courage of men, but the wisdom of children. The men with the courage to kill Caesar had not, before they killed him, decided what to do the day after. The day after was the funeral. Mark Antony, Caesar's consular colleague, who had been kept alive by the conspirators only because Brutus had argued that to add Antony to the kill list would be to turn a constitutional act into a massacre, delivered the funeral oration in the Forum on the 20th of March. The text of that oration is lost. Appian and Suetonius preserve two different reconstructions of it, neither of them word for word. The Shakespearean version we know, with the refrain about honourable men, is not in any classical source. What is in the sources is what happened next. Antony lifted Caesar's bloodied toga in front of the crowd, named the conspirators, and read out the dictator's will, which left a substantial cash bequest to every adult male citizen of Rome and made his gardens across the Tiber public. The crowd burned the body in the Forum that night on a pyre improvised from the furniture of the temple. They then went looking for the houses of the men who had killed him. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome and did not come back. In the same season, Caesar's heir arrived in Italy. He was Gaius Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew, posthumously adopted in the will, 18 years old, recovering from sickness, walking with a slight limp. He took the inheritance. He took the name. He took, more importantly, the relationship to Caesar's veterans, who had no political program, but had an emotional debt of their own. Within months, he had raised a private army. Cicero, the man Caesar had pardoned, the man whose hands would be nailed to the speaker's platform a year and a half later, saw in Octavian a counterweight to Antony. He delivered, between September of 44 BC and April of 43 BC, 14 speeches against Antony, calling them, in self-conscious echo of Demosthenes, the Philippics. The second Philippic is the most savage piece of personal political rhetoric in the surviving Latin canon. Antony, in the speeches, becomes a tyrant worse than Caesar, a drunkard, a buyer of citizenship, a man who has hijacked the Caesarian inheritance to set up his own dictatorship. The position is impossible. Cicero is arguing that the only way to restore what the conspirators wanted to restore is to destroy Caesar's lieutenant, using, as the destroyer, Caesar's heir, who is 18 years old and who has every reason to remember which of the senators cheered when his adoptive father was killed. On the 27th of November, 43 BC, the three men who actually controlled the Roman political situation, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, met on an island in a river near Bologna and divided the Roman world among themselves. The arrangement was made law by the Lex Titia a few days later. They called themselves Tresviri Rei Publicae Constituendae, 3 men for the reconstitution of the Republic. Unlike the informal triumvirate of Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, this one was legal. The first official act of the second triumvirate, Rei Publicae Constituendae, was to post lists of citizens to be killed on sight. The lists named senators, equestrians, men of standing, property forfeit to the state, heads brought to the Forum for inspection. Sulla's procedure. The conspirators had killed Caesar to escape the debt of mercy, and within 20 months the men who replaced Caesar were posting proscription lists in the Forum. The policy that died with Caesar was Rome's last serious attempt at non-vengeful politics for the next 300 years. One of the names on the first proscription list was the consul of 63 BC. On the 7th of December 43 BC, at a place called Formiae on the coast of Italy, the soldiers of the triumvirate caught up with Cicero. He had been hesitating for weeks. He had known, since the proscription lists were posted in late November, that he was on them. He had been near his villa at Tusculum when the news came. He had moved south to the villa at Astura. He had attempted to set sail from there twice and had twice been driven back by storms. He had reached Formiae. He had ordered his slaves to carry him to the sea again. They were within sight of the boats when the soldiers overtook them. Plutarch's account, written 150 years later, names the officers in command. The centurion was Herennius. The tribune was Popilius, a man whom Cicero, Plutarch reports, had once successfully defended in court. Plutarch's framing is theatrical, and the specific identification of Popilius as a former client is the kind of detail Plutarch enjoys. Whether it is historically reliable in every particular, we cannot fully confirm. The hands on the Rostra detail is multiply attested. Appian, Plutarch, and Cassius Dio all preserve it. Plutarch records that Cicero parted the curtains of the litter himself. He extended his neck. He was, the account says, looking at his killers steadily, as a man who had been a Roman magistrate for 40 years and who had decided that there was nothing left to negotiate. He was 63 years old. They cut off his head. They cut off his hands. They carried both, the head and the two hands that had written the Philippics, back to Rome. Antony, when they were brought to him, ordered them nailed to the Rostra in the Forum, the same speaker's platform from which the Philippics had been delivered. That is the closing image. The consul of 63 BC, pardoned by Caesar, defender of the conspirators, prosecutor of Antony, executed by the triumvirate, has his hands nailed to the platform from which he had spoken. Caesar had refused to do this. His successors did it within 20 months of his death. The Republic did not die because one man crossed a river with an army. It died because by the time anyone offered mercy as a political alternative to extermination, the institutions had lost the authority to ratify it. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe for more.